Alright, now continues the proletarian dictatorship of me spewing words into a recording device. This is World Solution Writing Process, Episode 21. Random Fragments, Part 4, plus some critique of the sacred cow known as The Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution, a text from the 1930s by the group of international communists, very popular among the left communist / neo-Trotskyist scene, which seems to just be this spiral I always find myself reiteratively looping through, despite not really having much actual social contact with the people in that intellectual movement. Seems to be everywhere. Anyway, let's just jump straight into the fragments, because they are just so delicious in their punchy succinctness and their extreme willingness to make vast, sweeping pronouncements on all manner of social, historical, and theoretical questions. Yeah, these random fragments are militant. They refuse to explain themselves. They merely state themselves, like the rhizomatic observations and singular statements of Deleuze and Guattari. However, I just want to give people a reminder, this is not the final product. Supporting arguments will be given for most of the claims made in these fragments, even if the fragments themselves do not provide that support. This is part of a writing process. So let's dive into the fragments. Fragment from the chapter West and the Rest. The United States will be the main spreader of socialism. That's it. That's the fragment. Next, from the chapter Declaration of National Refoundation. We must think of ourselves as historic figures in the early phases of our accomplishments. Not necessarily imitating any previous historic figures, but historic figures as ourselves, historic in the present time, making history in the present. Next fragment from the Class and Identity section. Governments are not the only forces which engage in disinformation, or intentional deception for the purpose of causing harm. Political groups and individuals also do it. Next fragment, Main Veins of Marxism. Stalinists and Maoists are massive bootlickers. That's it. That's the fragment. Next. Fragment on Class and Identity. You have to abolish racial poverty, or integration results in little more than a continuous race war. The point, of course, is not to reverse integration, but to make it more genuine and harmonious by abolishing racial poverty, and of course all poverty, and also admitting that integration has been obstructed under capitalism by the emergent behavior of self-segregation. Next fragment, Comedy. After the revolution, we're keeping the Geico Gecko. There will be no more commercials, and he will be a character in movies. Next, chapter on parallel government. We can distinguish between a platform, which is our list of immediate measures we will most publicly advertise, and our program, a full list of policies to be implemented over time. Next fragment, Revolutionary Dictatorship chapter. Bonapartist centralism can become necessary if the intensity of civil war destabilizes the economy of society. A much more real problem in the Russian Civil War than the American Civil War, historically. Managing the Old Regime chapter, fragment. A quote from Mike McNair. The militia proved insufficient to hold back either the Germans or the whites, so that Sovnarkom was forced to create a regular army, and with it, a bureaucratic apparatus. That's page 108 of Mike McNair's Revolutionary Strategy, explaining why you can't just depend on a popular militia. You have to have a machine. Anyway, next fragment from the chapter Revolutionary Dictatorship. Okay, so there were meetings called the Comintern. The Comintern was the group that brought together all the world's communist parties for the purpose of exporting the Russian Revolution globally. At its second Congress, it made some sweeping pronouncements on a wide variety of topics. Theses on the role of the Communist Party in the proletarian revolution was the thing that it was discussing, and it made many theses, which were discussed at length in Mike McNair's book, Revolutionary Strategy. Okay, so thesis 2. Only after the proletarian dictatorship has wrested out of the hands of the bourgeoisie such powerful media of influence as the press, education, parliament, the church, the administrative machine, and so on, only after the defeat of the bourgeois order has become clear for all to see, only then will all or almost all workers start to enter the ranks of the Communist Party. So this is revolution being made by a minority. A minority can and must take power, but it can be a mass minority which quickly becomes a majority. Thesis 13 called for iron military order. Thesis 16 claimed that local autonomy equals disorganization. Let me get the quotes while I record for these. The Communist International is of the opinion that, particularly in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Communist Party must be built on the basis of an iron proletarian centralism. To lead the working class successfully in the long and hard civil wars that have broken out, the Communist Party must create an iron military order in its own ranks. The experiences of the Communist Party that led the working class during 3 years of the Russian Civil War have shown that without the strictest discipline, complete centralism, and full comradely confidence of all the party organizations in the leading party center, the victory of the workers is impossible. Wow. I don't think you can get much more dictatorial than that. I'm just going to include that whole quote in the dictatorship section, because that's laying it on thick, in my opinion. But perhaps in the thick of it, you got to. Okay, Thesis 16. The spreading of a broad autonomy for the individual local party branches at present only weakens the ranks of the Communist Party, undermines its ability to act, and favors the petty bourgeois, anarchist, liquidationist tendencies. Man, intense. Yeah, one of my friends said something like they listened to the episode 16, I believe, on revolutionary dictatorship. And they describe the episode as intense. And yes, that is true. Revolutionary dictatorships are intense. I don't protest that. I am a person who has engaged in intensity, but is also sensitive to intensity. And, yeah, in some ways I'm not looking forward to the things that we must do. In other ways, I certainly am. Anyway, next fragment. Movement. How the movement grows over time. The futility which McNair blames on fragmentation is instead caused by the entire movement's failure to understand regime change, begin anti-government protests, or form an opposition legislature. Next fragment, revolutionary dictatorship. McNair's mistake is to trust that organizational democracy is possible in capitalist conditions, rather than being corrupted by class hierarchy, false consciousness, and the stress of artificial scarcity. Next fragment, main veins of Marxism. If you prioritize music over Marxist theory, you're not a punk. Next fragment from the chapter Multi-Party Socialism. In chapter 9 of Revolutionary Strategy, which I will look up while we do this, McNair refers to, quote, private ownership by state bureaucrats. Going to control F that one. Without democratic republicanism, the legal form of state ownership means private ownership by state bureaucrats. Page 152. So I'm someone who both advocates revolutionary dictatorship, but also fully understands the way that it can be hijacked from being revolutionary to reactionary, disguised as revolutionary, which is what I think happened in Russia. But yeah, so private ownership by state bureaucrats is something that's been discussed by many theorists who have been critical of the Soviet Union. You had initially Trotsky calling it a degenerated worker state, but some people, both from within his own ranks and also from elsewhere, described it as state capitalism. I used to be part of a group that followed that line. Now I prefer the term bureaucratic collectivism, which means that the economy is the private property of a bureaucratic class, and this bureaucratic class owns the means of production collectively amongst themselves, but not collectively with the people, hence the term bureaucratic collectivism. Next fragment, again on revolutionary dictatorship in that chapter. To be clear, the minority is not trying to trick the majority into taking power. Instead, the minority is leading the struggle to take power, which will either grow into a majority during the process of revolutionary struggle, or the minority takes power, then later devolves power to the majority as the majority becomes ideologically prepared to collectively and democratically govern a democratic socialist republic by direct participation. We must treat the majority as human beings whom deserve democratic sovereignty, but ones who have been brainwashed by capitalist propaganda and artificial scarcity, who need to be deprogrammed from capitalist Stockholm syndrome before being trusted with political power. In this way, the vanguard are like the heroes of a sci-fi dystopia story who smash the mind control machines. Except the mind control machine is the capitalist government itself, and eliminating that machine is only possible by building your own machine and installing it. Next, fragment, main veins of Marxism. We must imagine the ghost of Lenin cursing Stalin and spitting on Stalin's grave. Next fragment, movement, how the movement grows over time. McNair in chapter 5 of Revolutionary Strategy is wrong about the significance of splits. Separate organization is necessary to operate independently without being continually repressed and censored by the larger reformist organization, or being organizationally disrupted by expulsion from it. Bordiga is correct that separation is also necessary because of the way reform struggles and electoralism tend to more deeply entrench people into a reformist groove. Next fragment. Chapter Revolutionary Dictatorship. A minority can be a mass minority. The basis of legitimacy in a revolution is always necessity rather than representation, material well-being rather than democratic choice. Next fragment. Main veins of Marxism. If the answer lies somewhere between Leninism and Trotskyism and democratic socialism, roughly, but these are all contaminated by the New Left, then the answer is the tendencies which are critical of identity, including the notorious r/stupid poll subreddit. Those are some spicy people over there, that's for sure. Next fragment. Revolutionary Dictatorship. All McNair's contentions of non-Bonapartist regimes in Chapter 5 of Revolutionary Strategy are invalid. Cromwell's rule was a dictatorship. France was faced with multiple revolutionary dictatorships made necessary by the intensity of the revolutionary crisis, and the American Civil War did not involve the level of economic devastation of the Russian Civil War. Furthermore, McNair, I don't have a citation for that. I'm just commenting. This won't go in the book because I don't know where McNair said this. I think I saw in a video McNair saying that the Glorious Revolution, when William of Orange, I believe, took over England, that he described as a military dictatorship. And if that's the case, then, I mean, he seemed to be pretty supportive of it too. So, I don't know, McNair, he's playing both sides on the question of revolutionary dictatorship. And yes, it was William of Orange. I just checked the wiki, Glorious Revolution. I'll just put a note in. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was also something like a revolutionary military dictatorship initially, and is usually upheld as the gentler of the two English revolutions, as opposed to the extremity of the English Civil War. Next, Fragments. Chapter Multi-Party Socialism. Permitting factions and disagreements within the spectrum of revolutionary democratic socialism is better than being, quote, multi-tendency, end quote, to the point of including capitalist tendencies such as liberalism, anarchist tendencies which don't share the goal of constructing a parallel government, and Stalinist/Maoist tendencies which both historically and presently don't respect democracy in practice. Next fragment. Main veins of Marxism. The theories explaining socialist fragmentation into many small groups are as numerous as the small groups themselves. Next fragment, also main veins of Marxism. Therefore, this text advocates a heretical, dissident McNairism, which utilizes his concept of the correct form of a revolutionary state to an extent, but breaks from his electoral strategy. Ever since the, quote, base-building tendency, end quote, fused McNair's concept of the party state with Stalinism and Maoism, McNair must feel the same frustration watching we American kids modify his models as Brian in Life of Brian felt about the crowds who mindlessly repeated and distorted his teachings. End fragment. This is kind of one more about punk. Every punk is like a Muslim cleric debating about what is and is not Islam. What is true punk? Next fragment. Parallel government. I mentioned the People's Provisional Committee of North Korea was a provisional government, which is not always the same thing as a parallel government, but is sometimes. Rectangle square distinction. To be clear, a parallel government is one that exists in opposition to a standing government, whereas a provisional government may be formed in opposition to a standing government, or it may just be formed after the old government falls. So a provisional government may be a parallel government, but it's not always one in every case. And as much as I fixate on parallel government, I believe provisional governments are also worth studying. And Lenin, while he did use the term parallel government at least twice, also in many cases simply referred more often to provisional revolutionary governments. Anyway, fragment. Declaration of National Refundation. Congress is the center of the lies. Next fragment. Class and identity. The problem with immigration is that job competition is real. Unemployment has to be eradicated for the national workforce before more immigration becomes politically sustainable. Brexit occurred because the British working class was held hostage to globalization by European Union immigration policy, and still is due to the economic principle of gravity, in which nations are compelled to trade mostly with their neighbors, in Britain's case, with Europe due to shipping costs being defined by distance. Next fragment, multi-party socialism. Party systems are ideological, guided democracies, which means most political systems are ideocracies, or political systems defined by a certain ideology or idea. Next fragment, parallel government chapter. Despite his electoral orientation, even McNair is forced to hypothesize some kind of new government while envisioning the transition out of capitalism. Quoting him in Revolutionary Strategy, page 111, quote, "The existing state falls, and some party or coalition of parties, based on this aim, forms a provisional revolutionary government." McNair using Lenin's term here. Next fragment, class and identity. You can hate people for white flight, but it's also true that not only should no one have to live in poverty, but no one should even have to live in the dysfunction which accompanies even proximity to heavily impoverished communities, especially if you're raising kids, and this is an issue of working class quality of life. Next fragment. More class and identity. The European Union is neoliberal globalization, hidden behind a mask of political correctness, and the seeming post-nationalist progressiveness of regional unification. Oh boy, here we go. Class and identity. Another fragment. A socialist republic in which any man can be condemned by unproven personal accusations is a socialist republic which will not endure, and which may not even begin. It's already hard enough for socialist republics to begin and endure in the first place. The same applies to socialist organizations, which is why Lenin took the position he did during the Bauman affair. Yeah, just watch Fall of Eagles, episode 6, Absolute Beginners, I believe. Let me double check that for you, the listener. It's actually interesting to see how the Bauman affair led directly to the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, or preceded it in time very directly, which is dramatized. You can look it up on YouTube, on the show, The Fall of Eagles, episode 6, Absolute Beginners. It's really mind-blowing, because there was some pretty disgraceful behavior within the ranks of the Bolsheviks, and Lenin just said, we're not dropping the guy who's accused, because we need him to distribute our underground illegal newspaper. That was just like, it was a really utilitarian call that unfortunately I agree with, even though it's tricky. I think a lot of us have probably had someone in our life that we've had to push away, at least for a time, due to just perceiving ourselves as being harmed by them. But also, we've probably been pushed away by people who have described us as harmful in cases in which we may not have perceived ourselves as being harmful. And we all take turns playing every role, accuser and accused. And this is just sort of, I don't know if this is just a problem with life. It certainly has been exacerbated by social media extraordinarily. Hillary Clinton trying to weaponize identity in the 2016 election didn't help. It was the immediate precursor to all this. But I'm just trying to personally practice a balance between judgment and forgiveness. That's all I seem to be able to do. Old Testament, New Testament, and balance. But anyway, back to the fragments. Another on class and identity. Leftists seem incapable of realizing that most people don't live in their little leftist bubble. Next fragment, Revolutionary Dictatorship chapter. After the revolution, it will be necessary to defend the new government against both anti-socialist reactionaries, as well as culture war leftists whose idealist detachment from material reality may cause them to protest, attack, and destabilize the newborn socialist government. It's not like the Bolsheviks didn't get attacked by other anti-capitalist tendencies during the infant days of the Soviet Union. In fact, I'm writing that down. Next fragment, multi-party socialism chapter. Once the means of production has been seized, currency is reduced to the status of labor tokens in practice, even if this is never officially or unofficially declared. The group of international communists can rant and rave against centralization and state socialism in The Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution's thinly veiled anarchism, but their labor voucher system does require centralized accounting in practice, and is therefore not as horizontalist as they pretend. Nya. Okay, next fragment from the chapter, How the Movement Grows Over Time. Disregard the mass orientation for the hardcore and the vanguard. The, quote, micro-politics of the farseers, end quote, as Deleuze and Guattari describe, is the true politics. That's from page 201 of at least my copy of 1,000 Plateaus, their rhizomatic, mind-scrambling tome. Next fragment, multi-party socialism chapter. Using labor hours as the main method of accounting and exchange, parenthesis, as opposed to existing currencies, end parenthesis, is a sound principle of socialist economic accounting, but the question is how such a principle is to be brought into practice, and such a transition would inevitably require nationalization of some institutions, perhaps turning central banks into accounting systems of labor time, and central planning between the various worker-owned firms to prevent economic inequalities from emerging between firms, some of which will end up as more central to the economy by chance. Next, multi-party socialism fragment. Labor tokens do not so much abolish markets as create a market with a different currency. Even labor vouchers can conceivably be counterfeited and hacked. Next, why regime change chapter fragment. Do not place yourself in competition with reformist organizations on their own turf of reform struggles. Next, why regime change chapter fragment. True leadership often means telling unpopular truths as an isolated minority. Next fragment, revolutionary dictatorship chapter. A historical proof of the compatibility of revolutionary democracy and revolutionary dictatorship is the American alliance with Napoleon against the British in the War of 1812. That is some heavy grinding for some real history nerds there. Anyway, next fragment, revolutionary dictatorship. All revolutions try to use politics to force change onto civil society to an extent, but usually have the support of part of civil society in doing so, and thus constitute a conflict between opposing factions of civil society by the force of the state. Next fragment. Identity politics has a way of making itself the dominant overriding priority in every group. Obviously, that was the class and identity fragment. I make a note to myself to listen to some anti-flag songs, including Underground Network, Angry Young and Poor, School of Assassins, Captain Anarchy, and Spaz's House Destruction Party. I will get on that later. Alright. For the fascism chapter, a fragment, note to myself to look into The Devil's Chessboard, a book about the JFK assassination connected to global repression of communism. The CIA became the CIA and intelligence community, let's just say the intelligence community, became the primary vehicle for domestic and global ruling class domination. Okay, this fragment apparently is just for the podcast, not for the book. Having listened to various podcasts at length, I have concluded that I am the least dumb member of my species, and I shall march proudly forth in my podcasting endeavors with certainty in my voice. Okay, glad we got that off our chest. So anyway, next fragment, multi-party socialism chapter. Ensuring that socialism is democratic is now equally as important as socialism even happening, and in fact is critical to whether socialism will even happen. Next fragment. What if we designed a role-playing game where designing the role-playing game was the role-playing game? Next fragment. Combat chapter. Crowd revolution is modern guerrilla warfare. It takes space, it attacks, it retreats, it reorganizes, it repeats, it seizes power. Next fragment, class and identity. The left will be the initial popular phase of the revolution. Centrist Marxism will be the second Bonapartist phase which triumphs and endures. Main veins of Marxism fragment. Zizek is like the bizarre, rambling comedian brother Theodore. Next fragment. This is a spicy one, but I believe this. Identity politics is reactionary in its consequences, if not its intentions. But as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Next fragment on fascism. If the CIA are so patriotic, why haven't they taken pity on the exploitation and subjugation of the American working class and launched a socialist takeover in the United States or helped organize a socialist crowd revolution? Next fragment on change of government. The real Project Mayhem was the Petrograd Soviet Military Revolutionary Committee. Next fragment. Capitalism is bad chapter. Capitalist oligarchy is in conflict with the pro-social aspects of the market. More for capitalism is bad section. Modern monetary theory means that value is increasingly arbitrary and thus embodies raw class rule rather than representing some kind of fair transaction-based market. If value is arbitrary and it's all just money printing, why don't we just print money to meet everyone's needs? Why do only some people get the printed money and not others? If the scarcity is artificial, then all poverty and austerity policies are pure unnecessary injustices rather than necessary evils. Next, fragment, class and identity. In Lenin's context, when discussing being a tribune of the oppressed, this primarily meant the oppressed classes as a whole, and did include the oppressed nationalities and specific groups, but was always conceptualized primarily as the oppressed classes, rather than primarily specific subgroups. Next fragment, Why Regime Change chapter. The sea change which must occur is transitioning from protests for reform demands to protests directly demanding socialism, protests primarily demanding a change of government. We are all slaves to the grid. Police fragment. Why haven't the police or military overthrown capitalism out of duty to the people? Of course, the obvious answer is that under capitalism, these are ruling class institutions, but also made of humans. Next. In change of government, a 2-word fragment, study infrastructure. Next. National Refoundation chapter fragment. Tsarist Russia didn't have representation by single member districts, but representation by curia, or representation by population. This is my sort of critique of people who advocate an electoral path in the United States specifically, because there are special obstacles to the electoral path in the United States. And it's not just like, oh, you can't, vote a change of economy into being. I mean, in theory, you could, at the mechanical level of like, can a legislature vote to, do what the Bolsheviks did in, I think, 1918 and, issue a decree on nationalization or something, or, cooperatization or both. Yeah, a legislature can do that. The issue is more like a class issue that the American legislature won't do that, but this is true of all capitalist legislatures. The issue instead in America is even more specific. It's that, Lenin's policy of elections and trying to like run radicals for office was in a situation where his electoral system he was living under was actually more conducive to it. Because instead of these like district-based geographical representation or geographical-based representation to the legislature, you had a situation where they would elect these things called curia, which represented, it was called national representation or representation by population, where like, say you have like a national assembly where everyone votes, they don't vote based on like, oh, my senator is from like New Jersey or Georgia. It's just like everyone votes and they get proportional representation in the legislature according to which parties won the vote. And that allows like a lot more space for pluralism beyond two parties. There's this thing called Duverger's law where in any election where there's single member districts, which means one representative for each election, you can have a multi-member district where, you have like 3 representatives sent from each district, being voted on an election. And that creates more space for like third parties to get in. And basically I'm saying, Duverger's law is this pretty consistent pattern saying that, in the American first past the post, non-runoff, non-proportional representation style of elections, it always devolves into a 2-party system. And even in many, European countries that don't have as restrictive an electoral system as us, there's still kind of often 2 or maybe 3 main parties. And then there's a bunch of little stragglers. Now, I think what Lenin was really trying to do is he was not trying to get an economic transformation to happen by winning a majority in parliament ever. No, that was never his strategy. Instead, his strategy was to like use the legislature as like a bully pulpit for just a few Bolsheviks who would get elected, and then denounce the very legislature they were in from the floor of the legislature. And this is not something that you're ever really going to see from like DSA-endorsed candidates or DSA-endorsed representatives or officials or politicians. They're not that radical. You are never going to see AOC denounce Congress from the floor of Congress, even though it's absolutely what she should do. That would be the correct socialist thing to do for her, but she won't do it. She will never do it. And honestly, never say never. I could only see her doing this when there's already like a revolutionary groundswell against United States Congress. Maybe then, she would be swayed by, sort of the influence of the people, but not without that influence. So it's our job to build the influence of the people in a mass groundswell for a change of government against the United States Congress. So that maybe, because we don't have these opportunities to have someone, you have like Shama Sawant from the group Socialist Alternative, or I think now it's named International Socialist Alternative. And she, did some pretty radical things like saying that, when she was addressing the workers of Boeing, saying that like the workers of Boeing should take over Boeing. So she's probably the closest in the United States to anyone who's ever done anything like what I'm talking about. But I'm not making this stuff up. This was Lenin's electoral strategy. And the DSA people who claim that they're following Lenin's electoral strategy absolutely are not, because the electoral system in the United States is too restrictive to get anyone but like a tepid social democrat elected under a democratic ticket who is never going to denounce the legislature from the floor of the legislature, ever. So, the American system doesn't really allow Lenin's electoral strategy, and those in DSA who might claim that they're following it, partially they are themselves obstructed by American realities. But also, like, I don't think they're really being honest about what Lenin's electoral strategy really was. Like, they're just trying to put out this, like, they're just trying to spread propaganda of a general message of, like, hey, another system is possible, let's move toward that, and, let's try to pass, whatever good laws we can in the meantime. Instead, the issue is, it's not that we need to elect socialists. We need to elect revolutionaries. People who are against the ruling government. Elect them to government. This is what the Bolsheviks actually did. And yeah, they would give these fiery speeches from like the floor of the legislature, denouncing, the king, denouncing the legislature. And, sometimes they would get like, kicked out of the legislature for doing this. But the point is revolutionary agitation from within the political system, not merely socialist agitation, which limits itself to social democracy, which, means it's limiting itself, outside the sphere of socialism entirely. Anyway, that was a long rant for a very short fragment, but you love it. Yeah, so anyway, next fragment. If Lenin was alive today, would he be so focused on intersectionality, or would he find himself confronted with the fact that an endless flood of moralism, insisting on a futile treadmill of reform struggle and individual moralizing, was now obstructing any consistent focus on concrete preparations for change of government, and more importantly, on the lack of dual power at the governmental level? Next fragment. The abstraction of ideology has been typically socialized to be a masculine trait, and the necessities of revolutionary organizing involve an extensive amount of this ideological activity, such as theory discussion, or, quote, being a talk shop, end quote, publications, persuasion, and advanced niche strategic and ideological debates. So there's just an issue with people say like, oh, these socialist groups, like they're mostly men, and it's kind of self-selecting that way. But that can't always be solved, because like the tasks that we are doing, capitalism has this gender socialization thing where there are different areas of work. And the areas of work of a revolutionary organization are like this highly technical ideological stuff that, in my experience, a lot of women say they're more interested in the reform struggles. They're more interested in the, mutual aid and, political or electoral campaigns. And that's a gender divide. And it's almost like there are two subcultures within, any culture is divided into its masculine and feminine subcultures. And those subcultures have different interests. And you might not always, you think like, oh, people are facing structural oppression, and that's why they're not showing up, or like, oh, like we are part of the structural oppression, let's flagellate and guilt trip ourselves. No, sometimes it's actually a cultural difference of what people find interesting. So that's my ramble. Next fragment. Multi-party socialism. A compromise of sectors nationalized the top 20% of the economy, cooperatized the middle 60%, and the smallest third remains private, with the goal of gradually turning most of them into cooperatives over time. I'll probably restate that later in this episode at more length. Next fragment on multi-party socialism. Stalinism has massively weakened the Third World socialism and liberation movement by contaminating that movement's plural, by contaminating them with an anti-democratic politics, which made them undesirable and illegitimate among both the peoples of the Third World and the First World. Next fragment. How the movement grows over time. We can invite DSA to be part of the parallel government without putting all our eggs in the DSA basket. And for now, we'd probably be better off inviting individual DSA members and fellow travelers rather than making any formal proposals within the organization. Next fragment. Time is running out. Accelerate now. I've been forced to choose between prioritizing overthrowing Vladimir Putin and overthrowing global capitalism. As you can see, I've chosen global capitalism because I think if we do that, we'll bring down Putin. Also, I'm just kind of freaking out because I originally wanted to write a version of this book which was not anti-capitalist, but focused specifically on expanding the concept of parallel government and its usage within liberal democracy revolutions to help accelerate such a liberal democracy revolution against Vladimir Putin in Russia. And there is stirring of revolution in Russia again. Think of it as, my proposal is already being implemented. I don't know if I can really help those people. It's called the Congress of People's Deputies. It is a government in exile that exists in opposition to the, Russian Federal Assembly. Is that the name of the Russian legislature? Yeah, the Russian Federal Assembly. And also in opposition to Putin. And it consists, at least partially, of elected representatives who actually won elections in Russia and felt that they had to leave because of the increased crackdown and persecution under Putin that has really revved up since the beginning of the war in 2022. So depressing. We're just gonna have to blow it all up. Oh man. Anyway, next fragment, chapter Main Veins of Marxism. It's possible Trotsky maintained a description of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state because he didn't want to give Stalin ammunition in calling him a traitor, which Stalin was quite actively but wrongfully doing. And if Trotsky reclassified the Soviet Union as not a worker state, Stalin might have had more room to attack Trotsky as disloyal. Next fragment, comedy/dictatorship. Dictatorship is the worst thing and we've absolutely got to have it. Next fragment, how the movement grows over time. Starting revolutionary demonstrations with initial small demonstrations is kind of a super advanced galaxy brain concept. Galaxy brain in quotes, for those, not knowing it. Anyway, you have to convince people to participate by specifically articulating this fact to people. When they feel like the idea is odd, you can address and relieve their anxiety by explaining that all vanguard action seems a bit odd and surreal because it defies not only the false consciousness of society, but even the false consciousness within the movement, beginning usually as a minority opinion, working against the mental inertia of false consciousness rather than going with the flow of it being practically the very definition of opportunism. Time. Time is running out. Accelerate now fragment. This book solves the central unsolved strategic and thus practical and theoretical problems of Marxism, democratic socialism, Leninism, Trotskyism, neo-Trotskyism, and left communism. Yeah, I'm making some big claims. I'm feeling real big. Hopefully I actually finish this book someday. But you can listen to me write it for now. Next fragment, Main Veins of Marxism. Marx was a revolutionary democratic socialist. Next, change of government. There's a concept called dispersed disruption, where instead of having one big march, you filter out into neighborhoods and block intersections intermittently, then, retreat and go block another intersection. And this creates a chaos that police have a harder time controlling. I'm gonna type a little bit of that out. Next fragment, how the movement grows over time. We can hold noise demonstration style rallies banging pots, pans, and noisemakers, announcing the parallel government and calling for the disbandment of U.S. Congress, or the ruling government, the ruling legislature, or dictatorship, or regime. We can have short rallies, parading between multiple nearby locations, repeating the same or similar declarations at multiple places. Hyde Park in London needs a good declaration of a socialist parallel government in honor of Karl Marx's past speeches there. Likewise, the United States needs them at Independence Mall, and France needs them at the Salle des Jeux de Paume, where the Third Estate swore the tennis court oath. Alternately, we can just go to wherever there is the most foot traffic in urban centers. Okay, now for the rest of this episode, or most of it anyway, I'm gonna be quoting at length a text that I have listened to other people discuss and describe, including podcasts that don't return my emails, those snarky elitists who don't return my emails. I challenge them to listen to my podcast and, some of my critiques of the things they were saying. For example, I'll call them out, but in a friendly challenge, auxiliary statements that maybe some of the people, maybe they are influenced by, such as from Alpha to Omega. Anyway, they're reading this book called The Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution, which makes this argument that there can be almost a radically decentralized economy, which falls under the ideological umbrella known as council communism. I myself lean more towards a little bit of Bourdieuism, though I'm more pro-democracy than Bourdieu. So when I criticize these positions, it's from a position of sympathy, even if I do get sassy, which I do. So I'll just dive into it, and this is going to go in the part of my book, Multi-Party Socialism. So quoting chapter 2 of the Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution, published by a group called the Group of International Communists in the year 1930. Quote, "The substance of the matter is not that one would hold it against the Fourier system that it seeks to forge the entire economy into one single unit. Such an act of combination is indeed the end purpose of the process of development which is brought to fruition by the combined producers and consumers. Having done this, however, the basis must then be provided to italic, ensure that they themselves, the producers and consumers, keep control of it, end italic. To achieve, they must keep an exact account of the labor hours used up in every form of economic activity, in order that they may know exactly how much labor time is embodied in each product. Then it is quite unnecessary for the right of decision as to how the social product is to be distributed to be handed over to any, quote, central administration, unquote. On the contrary, the producers themselves in each factory or other establishment can then determine this through their computation of labor time expended." Okay, so they're advocating a system where currency is abolished and replaced with something called labor vouchers or labor money or labor certificates, which is basically money that you can't spend on factors of production. You can only spend it on consumer goods. And you get issued these in return for your work, not on the basis of like price and value as determined under capitalist markets, but on the basis of labor time contributed. However, I have some critiques of the model proposed. Here, the Group of International, this is my critique of it. Here, the Group of International Communists claims that labor time calculation will occur without any, quote, central administration, and instead the, quote, producers themselves in each factory or other establishment can then determine this through their computation of labor time expended, end quote. But later, the same book contradicts this by admitting the necessity of just such a central administration. How will we know whether individual firms are fudging their numbers? This does kind of get answered later. Every workplace is responsible for managing its own calculations, according to the formula P plus C plus L equals product, in which P equals the fixed means of production, like wear and tear on fixed machines, C equals the circulating means of production, like raw materials, and L equals labor. This is a good general formula, which any socialist society would have to utilize in some cases, and which individual workplaces could utilize, but would also have to be overseen by central coordination. Quotes from Chapter 4 of Fundamental Principles: "All productive establishments operating in the same sector of production must enter into cooperation with one another." Thus, we can see that the need to calculate the average social labor time is already leading to a horizontal coordination of productive establishments. This, however, is not being carried out by a bureaucratic apparatus controlled by the state, but grows out of the factories themselves from below. The whys and wherefores of the system are completely clear and understandable for every worker, whilst at the same time the necessity for open bookkeeping brings everything under public control. Seems a little idealist to me as an aside. Continuing the quote, "The fact that the individual productive establishments arrive at a differing average of socially necessary labor time is an expression of their differing productivities, which would have its cause in the one case, a more efficient, in the other case, a less efficient operation of either the objective means of production or of the living labor making up the production system of each separate factory." So some people might have better machines, or worse. Some firms, workplaces might just have harder workers or less hard workers. End quote. Now, my commentary is, what this doesn't address is the need for economic planning to follow a unified plan at the macro level, which could not be determined by individual workplaces or industrial sectors alone, as well as the possibility of corruption at both the level of individual workplaces and entire industrial sectors. And this is the real tea. I'm about to deliver the coup de grace. All right. There was nothing intrinsic in the Soviet model of combining currency with state planning that inevitably led to the degeneration of the revolution. Rather, the degeneration of the revolution was compelled by both civil war against the White Army domestically as well as the failure of the revolution to spread, as well as the specific political movement of Stalinism within the Soviet Union, which was actively resisted by both factional organizing and a literal coup attempt by Trotsky in 1927, and I will return to this point later, that the same vulnerabilities exist. In Chapter 11, Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution acknowledges the need for, quote, establishments for general social use, or public establishments. So these are probably almost more like your state-led firms. And who could these be run by but a sort of bureaucracy, even if it is a bureaucracy of self-managed workers? Anyway, next. Chapter 10, Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution. That there will be, quote, the establishment responsible for social regulation and control over production, end quote, and a, quote, office of social bookkeeping, end quote. Come back to this office of social bookkeeping again later. They do mention it again. My argument is that the office of social bookkeeping, which they propose, is essentially not too different in its bureaucratic centrality than the kinds of bureaucracies that the early Soviets created. So, anyway, my commentary, what I propose is the tried and true mixed model of a state sector run by bureaucratic administration, running the largest units in the economy, for reasons of maximum efficiency in providing a stable economic base which keeps running regardless of political disagreements, plus a cooperative sector of medium-sized units for economic democracy in the majority of the economy, plus a small remaining private sector of small businesses for the sake of efficient circulation and distribution of consumer goods. So I'll probably merge this, make a note, merge with prior statement on mixed model, what I call the mixed model, because earlier in the episode I mentioned something like that mixed model of socialist economy. Anyway, so back to fundamental principles. In chapter 5, here's a quote. In a society characterized by specialization of labor, the producers must receive a permit authorizing the consumption of goods socially produced, but destined for individual consumption. These are known as labor vouchers or labor money, labor certificates. Continuing. In this respect, these authorizations fulfill the same function as money under capitalism. Intrinsically, however, this is simply worthless material. It may be paper, aluminum, or any other stuff. The worker receives, in the form of these permits, just so much as corresponds with the actual labor hours expended. In common parlance, these permits are called labor money, although it does not constitute money in the capitalist sense. So, in Wikipedia, you can go look up something called labor vouchers. I forgot to put the link in that to my notes. Doing that now. This is a living moment of a podcast you are hearing. So anyway, these are alternately referred to as labor money or labor certificates. And I think the way they work is they cannot be spent on the means of production, but only on consumer items. But who issues these permits? Who prints this labor money? And how could the institutions responsible for these tasks possibly be considered anything other than a centralized state function? Also, there is another question, which is not an absolute problem, but what is to stop people from buying consumer items and turning them into factors of production? Because there are some things you could buy at a consumer level, but then you could use them for business. So it is possible to use labor vouchers in a surreptitious, subversive way against the socialist economy. But what I advocate is basically just recognizing that when you socialize the means of production, that all currency implicitly becomes labor vouchers. So maybe not that strictly, but roughly. I'm not really a labor voucher man. I'm for just keeping currency around for a minute and just having a mixed model of socialist economy, including nationalization, cooperatives, and some small businesses. Anyway, next, we have more from the Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution, Chapter 13. Communist industrial life knows nothing of the circulation of money and has no market. This is them, not me. It administers the stream of recorded exchanges by means of the Office of Social Bookkeeping, which it also refers to as the Gyro Center. I don't know why. By this means, all those producers who are not associated with the Office of Social Bookkeeping are brought into a situation of negative persuasion. They are unable to procure any raw materials and means of production for their establishments. Should they wish those establishments to continue in industrial activity, then the circulation of their manufactured goods must take place through the exchange control or gyro center established by the OSB, which is an acronym that they've used for their own invented Office of Social Bookkeeping. So, my commentary is, seems like the Office of Social Bookkeeping has an awful lot of central importance. What is to stop a Stalin figure from rising within its ranks? Conceivably nothing other than the struggle of the proletariat, which sometimes fails, as it did in Russia, but in the end, Such is the only defense available, meaning that the authors of, quote, fundamental principles have not created a system lacking similar vulnerabilities as the Soviet system. We simply have to maintain a vigilant political struggle against such a tendency. Next, fragments. Okay, I've gotten past the part about fundamental principles, back to my own writing. Fragment on nonviolence. The goal of insurrectionism is to create a situation which the police cannot control, but this can be done through civil disobedience without violence. A social movement demanding the disbandment of the current regime can create this situation in developed countries, and often in any country, often more effectively than military struggle. Fragment on the West and geopolitics. In Europe, we must finish the unfinished continent-wide uprisings of 1848 and 1917 to 1923, as well as, to an extent, 1968. Almost done. Almost done. Fragment from the chapter Multi-Party Socialism. Yes, it's true, Marx may have supported something like council communism in Critique of the Gotha program, but that's probably because people in the 1800s hadn't yet had their concepts tested by the practice of forming a socialist government that lasted longer than 70 days like the Paris Commune. Next fragment. How the movement grows over time chapter. Political education is always trolling. Not intentionally, but unavoidably, because it always involves telling people undesirable things. Next fragment. Time is running out, accelerate now chapter. This book echoes Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution insofar as it upholds socialism as a project for the short to midterm future, similarly demanding and insisting on the possibility of an accelerated timeline for socialism compared to the expectations of the majority of the socialist movement. In a certain sense, Trotsky, Lenin, and Parvis were, quote, accelerationists, unquote, before the term was coined. Okay, we're right near the end. 2 more fragments. Parallel government chapter. Parallel government is both ponderous in its historic centrality and recurrence, and also accelerationist for the radical offensive posed by even the existence of the concept. Final fragment. Why regime change chapter. If every class struggle is a political struggle, then all class struggle should connect itself to parallel government, including all labor struggle. So why don't the unions form a parallel government? They won't do it until someone else does it, but boy would it get a big boost if they got on board. So that has been a very long episode, which I'm going to have to, oh my god, spend a lot of time editing. Oh my god, it's going up to an hour. Almost an hour and 1 minute. What a nightmare. Anyway, this has been episode 21 of World Solution Writing Process, Random Fragments, Part 4, plus critique of the fundamental principles of communist production and distribution by the group of international communists in 1930 as they advocate decentralized, radically decentralized economy based on workers calculating the labor time required to do their work and getting paid in labor certificates or labor vouchers or labor money, which they claim is all non-central, but still uses a central office of social bookkeeping and other institutions to issue such labor vouchers. So, anyway, that's been a long and wild ride. This has been a long episode. Thanks for bearing with it. Have a good day. Signing off.